Hi, thank you so much for having me, Oberlin and the Allen Art Museum. Thank you to John Seidel and Sam and Jill for bringing me here and putting together this program and curating my work into Kitsch, Craft, and Critique, which I got to see for the first time today. It's a really amazing exhibition. Um, I've been rewriting uh, the introduction for this talk and reworking it more than I usually do for an artist talk, just given the current landscape of increasing scapegoating and criminalization of trans identities and in the United States and globally, and trying to think through how to introduce my work, which in large part kind of centers on questions of queer and trans communities and identities and histories. And I thought a good place to begin was just to kind of also remember generally what we lose when trans identity, we try to erase trans identity from culture, and thinking about how gender is like a kind of an individual constellation for each of us, whether you identify as trans or cis or neither, something entirely cosmically other. Um, and how this kind of formation of these both like cultural symbols of who you are and what you do and how you work in the world and move through space are so individual and ultimately so amorphous in many ways that when we try to police that, we're really restricting who you can be in gender and how those ideas work in the world, and how we, again, how it starts to limit what we think we can do as people and how expansively we think of ourselves, when we tighten the view of like who fits into what side of a binary. So I just wanted to open with that in terms of like the context we're in here in the United States, and even if you're not trans, like kind of thinking about what you might be losing as trans identities become more and more policed in our culture. That said, I feel like in terms of being an artist, I tend to lean towards um, joy. um, and also in leaning towards articulation. So my art career kind of started with drawing comics, very scrappy, very much like on just copy paper. I started a series called Gaylord Phoenix, and it is about a gender-changing Birdman moving through genders, moving through kind of fantastical spaces, getting laid pretty often. Um, and this Birdman was sort of a comic that was very much based on finding language for myself, and especially finding a visual kind of playful language for myself. It was maybe early 2000s. Gender queer was floating around. Trans hadn't really solidified necessarily as a cultural idea. There were lots of different ways to say it, express it. Something like a they, them pronoun were used in like tight communities, but not really like in common parlance. Like a preferred pronoun was a very like tight-knit queer community thing at the time. And so part of when I draw a panel like this that says, I will help myself, what was at the base of that was that this kind of like, oh, I feel like I'm starting to have language for myself. And that was finding community, finding people that I wanted to work with, artists, friends, sweethearts, weirdos. I had moved to Chicago, and a tight-knit queer community there really sort of helped me both learn to use visual language to express trans ideas, and also gave me kind of a community to have idea exchange with. And so when I think about where we're at currently, I really also I think very much about in-person communities and how important they've been to me, and how I think that when we're looking at what can happen online versus like the intimacies that you gain in an in-person setting with people, thinking through, not just thinking through, but practicing having in-person communities and friends and networks. This is the cover for a zine about the pilot conference. I didn't draw this. This was drawn by the artist Leidy Churchman. And this was an introduction to a conference that happened in Chicago that was pulled together by a trans-centered queer community working in the Bridgeport neighborhood of Chicago. The conference was built around trans feminism in 2004 and took the form of a 3-story television studio where conference participants came to make television shows with each other. So this was also before you could film everything on a phone. So there was an exchange of media making technology, like people would come and make shows, people would be teaching each other how to shoot video and edit video at the same time. And ostensibly, it was all these kind of weird, the programming was all these beautiful, chaotic television shows centered around the idea of trans feminisms and how we think through the intersection of feminism and trans identities. This is a shot from the event. I was the project lead on the big pilot wood sign, and the artist Flo McGarrell did the inflatable television. And one thing I am really interested in, I mean, I think having a rich community shaped what I wanted to do with comics and with my images. And I think that thinking through ways queer art works, and on a spectrum of that, I feel like my work more goes in towards like articulations of identity rather than like visibility necessarily. Like I think there are the lecture's called Out of Body because there's very few bodies in my work, and I tend to think very spatially and very trying to get at a feeling rather than my autobiography necessarily. That said, I feel like drawing and image making provides this weird and beautiful language for kind of trans concepts of embodiment, and maybe not necessarily even trans, but I always use this splash page from the comics as kind of a representation of like a feeling of still, like what happens when I'm very still with myself, and I almost have like a sensation of myself on like a cellular, very like particle level. I had felt that, I remember feeling that stillness as a child, and then also feeling it very much when I was kind of coming into language and visual language around my identity, and thinking through like, oh, a drawing is a way to try and get at a really bodily idea that I don't quite have the absolute language for. And I think that's something queer and powerful about image making, picture worth 1,000 words. And comics as like a narrative form had a real momentum to it in terms of like, I could move this character through many of these kind of symbolic experiences and really kind of reach for something I didn't have the words for, but I knew how it felt in a visual way. Also in terms of like thinking through sort of experiments in queer community, this is like a period of my life. I was working through comics, and there's a whole network of self-publishers and people who are kind of trading books and zines that I've been part of for many years. And so seeing those networks happen gave me a very like in-person sense of a network, and I began sort of thinking about touring, I guess is the simple word for it. And taking a show on the road with some friends. This is me and the artist Lee Relvis. We put on a little touring opera called the Peace Corps Tour. That was about, we went through, we did a loop around the country, touring an opera that asked the question, "Are you ready for a gay utopia?" And it was really surprising who said yes and who was a little like, I don't know. Um, but it really, I feel like in terms of, it drew from like both of us were making comics and zines, and we drew out concepts, queer concepts from those to put together this little opera where I was essentially, I have a voice like a pterodactyl, so I wasn't part of the opera per se. Like Lee did most of the bird-like singing. I kind of squawked along and told some jokes, but in terms of both like seeing these intimate formats like comics and zines, and then also kind of building out networks based on that. Like we knew a lot of people through those networks, and then we toured kind of based on those networks, and kind of strengthened our community. A few years later, I ended up buying a school bus that I lived on for a couple years. It ran on vegetable oil and sort of ate my life, but grew out of a different kind of trans network idea with some friends where people were talking about different rural queer projects and how you think about connecting those. Maybe it's a network of buses we live on and we travel and we perform. So trying to think as much into the possibility of weird ideas like that, not necessarily weird, but like networked and in-person ideas like that as I possibly could. And with the chance to kind of drive around in this weird little whale. Um, I mean, who could say no to that? um, my time on this bus kind of culminated in a roving variety show that rode along called the Fingers Tour. And we sort of performed until the bus broke down outside of Louisville. And but we all had different kind of like acts to play that sort of had these different resonances with each other. And the more we got into the tour, the more the conversation kind of deepened around that. So it was a real like conversation in terms of like queer performance and play, like in these sort of loose and shifting stage show. This is me as a gay Dracula in my custom cape and custom Dracula outfit and in the coffin I built in Baltimore. That I feel like I was like, ooh, building my own coffin. I wonder if that bodes well for the bus. The answer was no. The bus died. But taking care of a big vehicle like this and kind of trying to keep the wheels on a tour that's going around the country sort of stripped down my art practice to kind of its very most portable essentials. The narrative started like slipping away from the comics work I was doing, and I started focusing more on like the power of a single image or a pair of images to hold an idea. I was also really interested in um, uh, queer customizations, resourcefulness, and ornamentation, looking at queer codes and fashion and just in general the style and flash of trans and queer people, um, and these sort of not a dichotomy but a cohabitation of love and fury in queer history and life. I was also digging through the archives when I was in a city that I was like, oh, this is accessible. And really looking at a lot of kind of like beautiful humor and craft in the gay archive. This is at the Leather Archive in Chicago, and I really love this like phallic Mr. Florida Space Coast Leather 1996. Like it was really, I was like, ooh, I want to make drawings about or like that are the shape and size of like leather gear. And I had been on the bus, one of my primary art tools was just working with ballpoint pen. And I had developed this kind of filling in large spaces with ballpoint pen. So it had kind of like a leathery texture to it and making clothing items out of that. So this is kind of where I was at in my art practice as a visual maker. At the time, I was touring in the bus dies. I end up back in Chicago, which is I was born outside Chicago, and have lived there a few times in my adult life. But landing there in 2009, I was really struck by this feeling of history in the sidewalk, kind of. I would bike around town, I would walk around town and really kind of feel um, the way that kind of queer life and queer history is so fragmentary, but also so present. And I was especially feeling that in the architecture of the city because I think it has this layering, this ornateness, and this kind of scrappiness to it too. And I always use this slide to illustrate it because it was a building that really made me realize that connection where I was obsessed with this kind of motif at the very top. I really love a mystery door to nowhere, like the door that's like above the awning. Um, and then at the same time, there's like also a part of me that loves that it's like a dumpy mattress store on the bottom too, where I'm like, oh yeah, like there's like um this like beautiful unacknowledged ornateness on top. And it really kind of speaks to this like both the layering of history in a city and also like a kind of sly queer aesthetic. So I started working with architecture, and this is the first drawing I did, both kind of integrating that kind of leathery texture and where my life was at, which the bus had broken down. I had moved into a friend's closet, which I thought was really funny. These are the French doors of the closet, surrounded by a fabulous um, kind of like proto facade, and it's called the threshold of my closet. And so like starting to play with what it was like to be back in Chicago and feeling the history of the town, but not knowing it, I guess, is which kind of sent me. And I was talking a little bit earlier, maybe at lunch, that I'm not a super astute researcher, but I am a really good squirrel. So I'm good at finding like the clues of things, the snippets of things. I started like combing through old gay magazines and looking at ads of like places there, or not just ads, but like places people mention. I always bring up this ad, the Virgo Out, because I'm a Virgo. And I was like, if there's a gay bar called the Virgo Out that still exists in Chicago, I'm going to lose my mind. And there wasn't, it had kind of like rolled into the queer history of the city. And it sort of made concrete that I wanted to sort of take both the resourcefulness, like the beautiful resourcefulness as exhibited by the duct tape on this building, the overseas art building, and also kind of just ornateness of some of these architectural details, and combine them into uh, these buildings I started calling memory palaces, or the series of work is called Memory Palaces, to kind of play with this kind of spatial memory technique and how that makes a spatial memory technique of working with a memory palace that you walk through to remember something, helps make more concrete how we hold our memories. And then thinking through like what it means to be looking at historic queer spaces in a realm that's not nostalgia, but in a realm that is like, this place is exciting to find out about. Why is that? And what does that mean for the present? And so trying to think through concepts of how architecture and history and the past work and how queer space making can happen, how I can kind of push these ideas forward in my practice. And that's where this series of drawings comes from, the Memory Palace series. Some of them, like Chris Studios, were based on real places. Some were just amalgamations of exciting details in the environment that I thought, I was like, oh, if these come together, that'd be a really great gay space. So starting to work like both like dreaming into spaces that don't exist, spaces that did exist. There's also this body of work happened during a year where I lost quite a few friends. And so it also became a technique that sort of helped me grieve death, because the drawings took a long time to make, a long time to draft the patterns and the kind of the leathery work in the background. It all took this time that allowed me to both like think with my hands and reflect on their lives. So this is the gateway for the artist Flo McGarrell, who made the inflatable television that we saw in the pilot slide. And yeah, working with architecture and queer space making really started to make things solidify for me in terms of what I saw as a drawing practice and a painting practice, much in the same way as kind of comics narratives slipped away from me. So I saw like, as the bus left my life, my ability to be like a cohesive performer. Also, like that kind of narrative slipped away from me as well. But again, like these kind of like singular images as a way of like speaking. And I think that's something, yeah, I think that there is something that drawing and painting can do, that, or it can hold a feeling when you spend time with it that I'm not an adept enough like writer or performer to get at. So this really shifted into my main body of work. And the architecture of history also kind of fell away from these drawings to some degree as I kept working with them. The spaces became like, queer space became much more abstract as I was like, oh, how can we use architecture to look at kind of like quandaries and kind of also, I think I did like this series that was almost confronting like negative quandaries within trans identities. This piece is called Just a Stage, and was something, I grew up in a kind of like very religious and not very supportive household. So these kind of like negations of identity, like how do you process that into like, oh, if it's just a stage, like how do you make it as big as just a stage really is? This image is called the blood bank. Similarly, like thinking about being a trans person, queer person growing up against the backdrop of the AIDS crisis, and also dealing with kind of family conflicts as well, and trying to come up with single images where I could put I don't know, all of my excess psychology, I guess, for lack of a better word, like what can queer space making hold in a painful sense or in a mourning sense, as well as in a joyful sense or a potential building sense. And thinking through things, this building is called the Gender Changer. Thinking through like, oh, are we in trans identities and this is around 2014, 2013, 2014, I would say I was drawing this drawing. So it was a moment in time where trans visibility in culture was really on the rise. Also, medical care was becoming much more accessible than it had ever been in my life. And at the same time, there were these kind of reinforcements of binaries. And that was, I feel like, thinking of non-binary identity and how you envision that when it also feels like it's being so cemented even within a vast expanse of gender. So that was that's where a drawing like this came from, where these kind of shifting gendered columns like are the backbone of the whole structure. Yeah, so kind of building in these like queer quandaries into these architectural drawings. This piece called Before Stonewall kind of looks at that fragmentary element I was talking about earlier with the Virgo Out ad, where I was finding just these little snippets, these little like kind of moments of what is a place, how and having to um, postulate a lot of it because there's not information, that there's like traces of queer history. And similarly, this piece, The Retention Pond, trying to delve into abstract queer spaces, gaps in my memory, and watching the kind of solidity of the architecture I had been working with kind of fall away for a bit. Yeah. And so just also in a community sense, like this is a period of time where I had this art practice that was very took a lot of time and a lot of studio hours, but at the same time, like could not have been making this work outside of a life in community. So this is a poster from the dance party that happened in Chicago, Chances Dances. It was part of their gender neutral bathroom sign project, which for me, it was the first time that I was experiencing like, oh, like yeah, renegade, like not renegade, but like, oh, we're going to be at this bar and we're going to make all the bathrooms gender neutral. So they had asked artists to design different gender neutral bathroom signs. And so seeing that kind of come into reality, seeing these sort of like things that I feel like maybe like 5 years ago, I was like, oh, dare to dream or whatever. And then like, oh, okay, like great. We're working on that. We're thinking about it. We're having fun with it. And at the same time, or not at the same time, but like within 5 years, and I know this slide opened the lecture, but it's relevant. I had moved out to the desert out by Joshua Tree in California, where I've been for the past decade. I just recently moved to Vancouver, but after making the difficult choice to move away from the desert. But this marks a time in around 2016 where a politician was running a transphobic billboard out there on a major highway. And so it was kind of an introduction to what can happen organizing in a rural space. There was a small community out there, and we were like, I don't know. I mean, I feel like for me, it was like I was driving miles and miles and miles away from, or like out of my way just to avoid looking at this transphobic billboard. And so it was just such a relief to also like first be on like an email chain and then be like griping in person with people and then kind of cementing a plan that like, oh, we could get a hold of this billboard after that messed up one goes down and we could figure out messaging. Like it was this kind of, it happened fast and also at the same time, uh, rural, like living in rural places, how I'm not from a rural place, so how activism looks and how it works there was sort of a, like finding ways for it to work was a puzzle that continues to unfold for me. But I was really um, moved by the intimacy of this little group. It was also dysfunctional. Like it wasn't like something that we worked forever and ever or, moved forward with, but that we were able to get something very big done in a short period of time. And yeah, this kind of moves us into the COVID pandemic. Um, and so I was in the desert uh, in 2020 and um, seeing this kind of atomization that and isolation that people slipped into, seeing a lot of community kind of like slip apart. Um, and thinking a lot about queer community and uh, queer organizations and thinking about how I've looked at queer and trans histories and that it's things that happen and they don't necessarily last, but it's worth thinking about, okay, if trans communities are under-resourced, that it may be something where we have to come together and build something with joy and watch it kind of wash away and have to be ready to kind of come together again and rebuild something else, the next thing that we need. So I was really I was looking I was looking at a lot of sand under the microscope and thinking about particles coming together and really thinking about the sandcastle as an architecture that embodies that. So my paintings shifted from these concrete quandary places to these more loose, like uh, gay sandcastles, and experimenting with uh, collaging particulate into these structures, painting them and knowing that like, oh, this represents something that is a space that comes together and it washes away and kind of trying to teach myself the lesson that like that's okay and that's also something to like also as we move into like a future of climate uncertainty as the world can feel like a dumpster fire sometimes, thinking about what our resiliency looks like and what we'll need to kind of configure and keep configuring within community. And this like language of particulate sort of shapes the next uh, kind of realm of my paintings where much like the comics, I thought it would be, I think that the little particles speak to both something concrete, like a sandcastle, like what a sandcastle does, and they speak to something that's kind of more amorphous for me, more that something of like something coming together in a spirit or being apart in spirit, being in community. So trying to use these little shapes to see what they do, like what they do when they play. And then also to see this kind of, I thought of it as I was painting, I thought of this as sort of like a little bit of an alchemy of these spaces. Like sometimes they're very much enmeshed and joined together. Other times they sort of let themselves fly in all directions. And so kind of thinking through not so much a concrete idea of community as those sandcastles, but more of an alchemical variety of community, like what kind of magic can happen in these queer spaces. Um, yeah, along this kind of uh, I guess arc in my painting work, the opportunity to do some larger pieces also opened up in my life. I've tried to take on work that kind of poses that I think I could speak to in an interesting way. But I feel like this piece, I include it because I feel very fraught about it. It was it was part of what was then Facebook Artist in Residence program in Los Angeles. And one thing I think about saying yes to this project was that I have I have like a little bit of a squirrel theory about digital spaces and thinking through binary and non-binary thinking, where at the root of kind of digital language, we have this base binary writing it all. And when you have that, does it unwrite something? Does it eliminate the possibility of kind of a non-binary conversation or entity? And it's very like, if it's not binary, it doesn't work as a language. So this mural is called Can Binary Code Sing a Non-Binary Song? I'm trying to interrupt these black and white patterns, these either or patterns with relief shapes. And I think that by the end of the mural, I was like, I don't know if it can. So I was like looking at, I was like, ooh, okay, suspicion confirmed. But but I think maybe Facebook does that more than a mural ever could. Um, but just kind of trying to get to some of the weirder things about or like art, the weirder articulations of um the trans parts or not trans parts of culture and how we can look at our world. There are other murals happen that I felt really opened up some potentials for me. This was a mural that its execution is kind of ended up being a little strange because it wrapped around the inside of a stairway at the drawing center in New York, but ultimately it's a facade, and this is an imagined kind of ecstatic facade for a newsletter. I think it's the first or one of the first newsletters for trans men called The Labyrinth. Um, and I mean, I think even if you think back to, or if you remember from earlier in the lecture, back in when I was making comics, a lot of I would draw little mazes that the characters would move through a lot, and really thinking about the difficulty of navigating, uh, especially like kind of understanding or coming into trans resources. I feel like when I first came out, there wasn't necessarily, yeah, any or a lot of medical information for trans masculine people. And so it was kind of watching that history, well, not history, watching that unfold along with me, but also knowing that there's stuff in the past going past in the past. Yeah, and just kind of using these maze motifs to sort of honor this historic space like the memory palaces did and imagine it as magnificent and decadent and important. Yeah, this is another mural. This happened in the Bay Area, and of course, an area that has been going through decades of a housing crisis. And I approached this right after helping an older trans friend try to find housing in the desert and kind of confronting how difficult that was and the obstacles that they faced looking for housing as an older person in an area that wasn't necessarily under a housing crisis and kind of thinking through aging, what and also not just thinking through aging, but thinking through like the spaces I want in the world and envisioning those in a way that's not just like practical, but also dreams into a kind of queer spatial fabulousness. That is sort of like these larger works, being able to kind of hold these architectures have allowed me to kind of bring, when I'm painting now, especially when I'm painting in the desert, I'm thinking a lot about the way biomes work, the way water works, thinking through where we're at in terms of climate, because it's a environment where you can really feel things getting hotter and drier. Trying to think through um, where how queers are going to support each other in this, and also how everyone is going to support each other. The potentials for community as opposed to opposition and scarcity. Thinking into queer bounty, and thinking of that as kind of how can I see that as an abstract architecture? Like I don't need a concrete architectural metaphor to capture some things where I'm like, oh, it's so intangible, and yet I so want to paint it. It's not, sometimes I touch it, always I want it, and I also feel like it's an idea worth trying to um, work into my images. So just kind of, yeah, I mean, I think this isn't always the painting I close with, but I think for this lecture, it really fits. It's a large painting called Trans Body Dares to Dream. And it sort of was, it was a shifting point in my painting work, and sort of where I'm at now. We're like looking at, I mean, it feels so, yeah, like this aspect of wanting so much from like such a broken world, and wanting to continue putting my energy into community even when it's hard. Um, a want of kind of bounty and connection for everyone, and trying to think through how would you even paint that, Yeah, and I don't know, with that, like we're at such a moment in time right now. It's so hard to like mm, plan, think about what to do, but to remain connected to each other, and to keep our thoughts and love alive, I guess. That's such a wild way to end a lecture, but yeah, I think that's it.